Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Devorah Margolin. I am Director of Strategic Initiatives and a Senior Research Fellow at the Program on Extremism. And I am delighted to welcome everyone here today on behalf of the Program on Extremism and the National Counterterrorism Innovation, Technology, and Education Center, NSITE. Thank you for joining us and our esteemed panel to discuss today's events titled Foundations of the Foreign Fighter Problem, Investigating Blind Spots Related to Gender, Minors, and Families. Before introducing our panel, I'd like to do a little bit of light housekeeping. The panel is scheduled to last 1 hour. Each of our panelists will speak for approximately 5 minutes before we open the floor to questions. Please use the question and answer function via Zoom, and this can be done at any time during the event. You can start to populate questions right now if you'd like. Additionally, today's program is live streamed through YouTube and is available on YouTube after the event for future viewing. Today's event is supported by an active DHS S&T grant led by POE and NSITE, examining best practices for reintegration programming for women and minors who travel to join foreign terrorist organizations. And for this event, we'll be discussing the scope of the foreign fighter problem and providing insights into some of the major existing knowledge gaps related to gender, minors, and families. This panel could not have happened at a more appropriate time. The recent attacks in Syria, targeting prisons, holding IS-affiliated minors, and the case of Alison Falk-Ekren, announced this weekend, once again propel this issue into the spotlight. To address these issues, we're joined today by an excellent panel. First, we have Dr. Austin Doctor, Assistant Professor of Political Science, University of Nebraska at Omaha, a member of the Executive Committee for the National Counterterrorism Innovation and Education Center, NSITE, and a DHS Center of Excellence, a non-resident fellow at the Modern War Institute at West Point. We're also joined by Dr. Joanna Cook, Assistant Professor of Terrorism and Political Violence in the Faculty of Governance and Global Affairs, Leiden University, and a Senior Project Manager at ICCT and Editor-in-Chief of the ICCT Journal. Mustafa Ayad is the Executive Director of Africa, the Middle East, and Asia at the Institute for Strategic Dialogues. And last but not least, Professor Mary Beth Altier, Associate Professor of New York University's Center for Global Affairs. And without further ado, I will hand this over to Austin Doctor.
Well, Deb, thanks so much for the introduction. It's a privilege to join this great group, and I'm excited about this opportunity to discuss this really important and timely topic. As Deb mentioned, NSITE and the Program on Extremism have been working together to identify notable knowledge gaps relating to the foreign fighter problem. And so this is in support of our broader effort to promote best practices for the reintegration of foreign fighter spouses and children. And we're grateful to have the support of the Department of Homeland Security's Science and Technology Directorate. They've really been an amazing partner in this work, though I should be clear for the purposes of today that any ideas or opinions that we discuss here are strictly our own. Since I'm first up, let me establish some of the broad parameters of this particular problem set. Bottom line up front, I'm going to argue that many of the stalemates that are hampering current reintegration efforts are a function of how we conceptualize the life cycle and unique experiences of the foreign fighter family. As an outline, I'll focus on the experiences of foreign families across 3 stages of their activity in understanding how and why foreign travelers bring their spouses and children with them, the experiences of those families in theater, and in some instances, how foreign travelers build new families in conflict zones, and finally, the fragmented nature of their return to their countries of origin. So first, within the pre-departure stage, prior to their travel, is where we see the foundations of the foreign fighter family. And I want to be clear, just in terms of setting a baseline, that while a large percentage of foreign fighters in Iraq and Syria were married, most foreign travelers didn't initially bring their families with them to the conflict zone. That being said, many of them also did. Ari Perlinger, Daniel Milton wrote a really great report a few years ago on the individuals who traveled to Syria and Iraq during the 2011 to 2015 period, that time of transformation into what became the Islamic State. And they found that half of the travelers in their sample were married, and almost 1/3 of those had children before traveling, and an additional 10% married after arriving in Syria and Iraq. And so broadly speaking, with these descriptives in mind, this dynamic seems to be more common in certain types of insurgency campaigns. In particular, we see the mobilization of foreign fighter families in campaigns with clear state building aspirations and relatedly with intentions to rearrange society around certain ideological commitments. And it's in these movements that the family unit serves as a critical building block of a new vision for the state and society, right? And this isn't just the Islamic State. Al-Shabaab in Somalia and the Taliban in Afghanistan, for example, have all featured relatively high numbers of foreign fighter families relative to other militant organizations. In the case of the Islamic State and in building their caliphate, they needed to show that they're not just a rebel group, right, but an aspiring state. And that state needs a society, not just soldiers. So this is part of the narrative that brings in foreign fighter families and mobilizes them prior to their point of travel. Second, in the in-theater stage, once they've arrived, foreign fighters had a multitude of experiences, in part because some arrived as a family unit and because others were formed in the middle of conflict. And I'd like to speak briefly to the experiences of children and women in these families specifically. The lives of foreign fighter children are multifaceted and diverse, but all involve varying levels of coercion, of manipulation, and of trauma. And a number of factors make this highly complicated. While all foreign children should primarily be seen as victims, they also show differing levels of agency in their response to militant groups' recruitment and educational programs. Some children were integrated into the Islamic State's military efforts. Other foreign children were used in support of the group's political and propaganda efforts. In other words, foreign children will have often been both perpetrators and survivors of violence and violent extremism, complicating efforts of assessing the risks posed by these persons, reintegrating them in society, and treating their trauma experienced in theater. For married women, the media has often used labels like jihadi brides, but these women had diverse experiences under ISIS rule. And it's true that some were sort of solely or strictly married to ISIS members, but many others worked as doctors or as teachers. In some instances, women served as part of the domestic security forces or in conventional military training and later operations. Dev and Joanna, I know, have both done really brilliant work on this. The recent Ekring case has brought this dynamic to the forefront of our news cycle just in this past week. But this is all to say that addressing questions surrounding repatriation and reintegration requires a nuanced understanding of children's and women's experiences as individuals and as members of a larger family unit within the ISIS campaign. Finally, in the return and that final stage of the life cycle, things get more complicated. The first thing I want to flag here is that the means by which ISIS foreign fighters and families return to their home countries varies across formal and informal pathways. Public policy tends to emphasize the more formal aspects of return. The US government, for example, has recently taken the lead globally in encouraging the world's nations to bring their detained foreign fighters and families back home and to establish programs for their reintegration and rehabilitation. But foreign fighters also return through less formal channels, and these cases are likely going to require nuanced attention. Over the past few years, for example, the US approach has led to the formal repatriation of 28 persons, including 16 children from Syria and Iraq. However, the Program on Extremism has also identified more than a dozen individuals who returned to the US on their own accord, and there are likely more, right? And so this brings the total set of returnees closer to 44, which is half of which, right, are individuals born abroad or minors when their parents traveled to join the Islamic State. And so the range of pathways of return, I think, calls for a closer look of how we tailor our tools of reintegration and rehabilitation. So I'm going to close there and hand things over to the rest of the panelists, but I'm excited to dig into this more during Q&A.
Thank you so much, Austin. Joanna, I'd like to hand it over to you now.
Thanks, and I'm going to end up echoing some of the points that Austin's already made, and that I'm sure Mary Beth and Mustafa will also make too. But firstly, thank you to George Washington University and POE for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be on the panel with these great speakers, speaking about a topic that I know we all care very deeply about. My comments today, very brief comments, will draw from research I've been doing since 2014, including 2 co-authored reports I did with Gina Vale in 2018 and 2019, tracking women and minors affiliated with ISIS, and 2 current projects I'm working on related to both women and children in Northeast Syria, including the EU-funded Prepare project focusing on the stigmas and vulnerabilities of children of violent extremists. So I'm going to spend my time highlighting some of the challenges and implications that I have found tracking and understanding populations associated with foreign terrorist fighters, largely adult women and minors. So first, looking at gender, the first issue that obviously comes up is stereotypes around gender. Stereotypes related to women and violent extremist groups have often viewed women as non-threats or just family members. So not only has this meant that many countries have not paid attention to women who have radicalized at home, but they also didn't keep track of those who were leaving their countries to go join the foreign terrorist phenomenon. And this was particularly true of the MENA region, where in our report that we did, we noted only about half of the countries examined from the MENA region, for example, even accounted for women. It also impacts real figures and data. It was not clear how many women then proportionally went as a total population of those who traveled to Syria and Iraq and became affiliated with ISIS. So there was a serious gap in real figures. So me and Gina could confirm that at least 16% of women globally comprised travelers, but because half the countries in some of these regions didn't even publicly release figures, that figure was likely much higher. So we still don't even have a full grasp of the phenomenon. It also means there's gaps in demographics, including age, background, motivations for travel, which still remain unclear with some of these individuals. This could not then be sufficiently responded to in policy, practice, or proactive interventions. This also has implications for locating men and women after 2019. If women were not accounted for going, then looking at how they're accounted for following the fall of the caliphate. For example, if they were taking up roles in other groups, if they were killed, if they'd returned or moved to other locations, remained unclear in some cases. So this has implications today. It's still not clear where all of these individuals have traveled to or where they've ended up or what the fate of these individuals has been. Are they being accounted for by state actors? If they've returned to their country, have they been tracked? Are they monitored? Are they even accounted for? Have they gone through programming? Have they received support they may require, such as psychosocial support? Have they gone through the criminal justice system where appropriate? Crimes and accountability. So accounting for potential crimes that may have been involved in or criminal charges that may be applicable to them, including the kinds of justice that might be absent right now for victims. Women have also been a secondary focus in a lot of the prosecutions, and there's been some really good work by Rebecca Turkington and Audrey Alexander that have looked at this in the case of the US in particular. Gender limitations also meant it wasn't always clear who did what in the Islamic State. So if you were having difficulties tracking who went, it was also earlier on in the phenomenon unclear what people were doing. So understanding really what the very gendered roles imposed by ISIS were and what that meant for men and women, boys and girls. There tended to be a preoccupation with focusing on men as militants. And as Austin mentioned, really getting clarity on some of their public roles otherwise. And I think the final point in relation to gender, before I move on to some quick age-related points, is that gender does not equal women. And so while I myself tend to focus a lot on the roles of women in relation to foreign terrorist fighters, it's important to remember that gender is not only about women. And we have to think about the gendered implications of tracking men and accounting for men as well. So in line with what I've already mentioned, there appeared to be a trend that assumed that all males that traveled went with the intent of becoming fighters. So it's important to identify, question, and even challenge gendered assumptions to ensure we have a true and accurate image of who traveled, why, and under what circumstances. For example, were there cases where men went as dependents, for example, as elderly parents with their children? Were there cases where men were going to try and bring family members home, such as children or wives who had traveled independently? Were they being tracked as foreign terrorist fighters? Were young boys also being married off? From what age? And how would this be considered or approached in terms of considerations around child marriage? And also tracking different outcomes for men and women now. I'll very briefly touch on some age-related tracking considerations as well, specifically around distinguishing foreign terrorist fighters from child victims. So the question focuses on foreign terrorist fighters, but children as family members should not be viewed as foreign terrorist fighters. They are victims and family members and forcible affiliates of ISIS in cases where they've been abducted or trafficked across international borders. For those that grew up under the caliphate, ISIS established its caliphate in 2014, and it's now coming up on 8 years after they emerged. And this length of time has several age-related implications for how we understand and trace children today and the implications of this. First is the increasing number of children being accounted for due to birth. The number of new children being accounted for as ISIS-affiliated family members, as any child under age 7 and under was likely born over there. This demographic has thus increased substantially since 2014. The nationality of the child is also an important distinction when tracing these children today. For those that are born to parents of 2 nationalities, which jurisdiction has responsibility over them, especially in cases where one parent is missing or killed, or where there's a lack of DNA testing? What about children who grew up and are now adults? So children who were very young when they were taken over there might have grown up to 8 years old. So some of these, children who have now become adults. So any child that reached age of majority while in Syria or Iraq. So also considering how children have become adults in these calculations as well. Finally, considering children in the law. So the age of children has implications for how they're tracked now in juvenile justice procedures, including victim-centered approaches. The legal age of criminal responsibility is different in each country and impacts if and how children are moving through legal systems and receiving the type of support that focuses on the victim-centered needs of the child. Detention settings also come up in the case of boys, such as those over 10 who have been moved to places like prison settings, as was recently highlighted in the case of Hasaka Prison and the 700 to 850 boys that are being accounted for in detention settings as opposed to camp settings. There's finally broader implications for the status and well-being of the child. What developmental stage were they at when they arrived? How did this experience impact their development? And this becomes directly relevant to identifying the vulnerabilities, risks, and related stigmas they may face and how they can best be supported today. So this has been a very brief overview of some of the primary age and gender-related implications related to tracking foreign terrorist fighters and their families through a gender and age-conscious lens. And I'd be certainly happy to discuss any of these further. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanna. I'd also like to remind our audience the question and answer function is open. Please feel free to start populating questions as we go. And with that, I will hand over to Mustafa.
I just want to thank GW as well as Insight for hosting this, and of course the panelists who I believe are all way smarter than me. But let me just start off from a point. I am not an academic. I am a researcher, and I am an international development practitioner with over 15 years of experience working in conflict and post-conflict zones. I've previously worked with foreign fighter men reintegrating in the United States, and I've also worked with minors who were arrested, detained, and are reintegrating in Lebanon, and those who are currently in IDP camps in Iraq and labeled ISIS sympathizers based on familial connections and where they come from. While the focus here is on the foreign fighter challenge of women and minors, I think Iraqi women and minors that have been relegated to IDP camps in Iraq and labeled ISIS families or sympathizers face similar issues and can provide some insight into this conversation. So there are 3 primary challenges here that I think need to be addressed. And again, while I recognize this is a discussion focused on repatriating and rehabilitating of foreign fighter women and minors, there's some acute challenges to these issues already in play across the MENA region with populations in Iraq and Syria. It's not just countries that are reluctant to bring back and repatriate men, women, and minors, but there's a larger issue at play in the region in regards to communities that are actively ostracizing, as well as in some extreme cases, actively hunting the women and minors that are allegedly linked to the group. These are people who haven't been charged with crimes, but are ultimately labeled ISIS sympathizers based on familial connections or their participation in the sort of civic service infrastructure under ISIS rule. Based on my experience, both working with those detained and those individuals and organizations that are helping support those who are detained in IDP camps, here are my primary points. Bear with me. 1, is, and Dr. Cook already mentioned this, one is a lack of accurate data, research to date on detention, prisons, IDP settlements, and formalized refugee camps across MENA, which is based on, and I think, primarily the securitized responses to these populations, obviously. There are also a range of human rights abuses that are happening in all of these settings that are not being actively addressed and are also compounding the issue. And I'll get to that on my third point. And my second point is specific to rehabilitation systems within these current environments, especially with a range of different populations. We're talking men, women, minors of different age groups, differing levels of engagement with the group, if any at all, familiar backgrounds, context. I just don't think the systems for delivering rehabilitation in these contexts is built for this challenge. And the enabling environment actually works against it. Currently, these programs are much more focused, and I'm speaking about MENA currently, on the ideological challenge. Read religious here, especially in this context. While not addressing, and Dr. Cook mentioned psychosocial, the trauma, and it's often compound trauma, not just of the conflict. But imagine growing up in your family, I imagine you went through some trauma, add that sort of familial trauma to it as well, plus the conflict. And that trauma is so rife amongst these populations. Similarly, there's a challenge of trying to rehabilitating men, women, and children as they're continually re-traumatized by the conditions of the camps that they are in or the prisons that they are in. So many of the children I have had a chance to speak to have serious trauma. Many of the youth have serious trauma. Some, as one NGO partner in Iraq mentioned, are on actual militia kill lists. These are militias that are sanctioned by the government and are escaping the very real issue of actively being hunted. They lack any civil documentation, making them ineligible for any education. And they are similarly traumatized at the same time. And then my third point, and I'll leave it at this, is a narrative challenge. And that is becoming more acute as time passes by. We saw this during the prison break, actually. And it's being deployed by a range of different Islamist groups, not just the Islamic State, that latch on specifically to the hypocrisy of Western states on the issues of human rights. And similarly, there are client governments across the Middle East and North Africa that are contributing to the sort of abuse of Muslim women and children. So all three of those issues, which are at play in a lot of the IDP camps across Iraq, are ones that I think need to be taken into consideration when thinking about the foreign fighter challenge of men, women, and minors.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, I will hand it over to Mary Beth.
Thank you. So I wanted to just thank you for the opportunity to be here to speak today on such an incredibly important topic with such esteemed panelists. I think I will echo some of the points that have already been made. I did want to preface my comments by saying that unlike some of my colleagues on the panel, I am not an expert on gender, minors, or families, but I have conducted a good deal of research on terrorist disengagement, re-engagement, and reintegration. And more recently, I've examined the lessons we can learn from the international community's 30-year history of disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration programming. So during the course of all of that research, I have made a few observations about gender, minors, and families, some of which I'll highlight here today. And I'm happy to talk more in the Q&A. So the first thing I wanted to say is that I think it's imperative that we do not underestimate the agency that some women have, not only over their own actions, but also within their families. So several years ago, I interviewed a former Islamist extremist, and she had led her family, including her husband, into the movement, and she eventually actually led them out. And so she described to me how at a certain point she became deeply disillusioned with her involvement for various reasons. And she told her husband, look, I'm going to leave now, I can't have it. And so when I asked her how this played out, given the extremely conservative version of Islam that they adhered to, she replied, I'm the one who's quite sort of dominant in my house. I rule the roost, he doesn't govern me. So she explained that no one knows what actually goes on in her own home. Second, despite the fact that some women like this one have a great deal of agency over themselves and within the family, many do not. So quantitative and qualitative research shows that women generally have a more difficult time disengaging from violent extremism despite deep disillusionment because they tend to lack viable alternatives. So women may not have the requisite education, skills, or job history necessary for employment. Those with children are often unable to afford childcare, even if they do find employment. Some may be confronting domestic abuse. So women seeking a way out of violent extremism, we know from research, often have a harder time seeing a way out. So any programming must be cognizant of and address the additional barriers, as my colleagues mentioned, that certain women face so that they can envision this clear pathway out of violent extremism. Third, the much more expansive literature on DDR similarly suggests that women and children associated with armed groups confront additional logistical challenges and layers of stigma, which I think has also been highlighted. And these impede their reintegration. So as we see with the foreign fighter phenomenon today, DDR programming historically prioritized men and desecuritized and depoliticized women and girls. So women were often excluded from programming, and if included, the emphasis was on finding men, not women, jobs. When women were offered employment training, it was often in side-generating income or traditionally low-paying female jobs. Women described this programming as not the skills they desired, as increasing their dependency on men, and as infantilizing. So many women could also not even attend training or other related programming as they lacked adequate transportation or childcare. Others chose not to participate to avoid stigma, especially in cases where armed groups engage in abduction, forced marriage, or sexual assault. The failure of that programming also to recognize the important roles women played within many armed groups fueled their grievances and a sense of injustice. Programming also in the literature is described as reinforcing militarized masculinities, which I think Joanna brought up a little bit, and the patriarchal order, as well as a missed opportunity to promote and highlight the value of men's roles as caregivers. Fourth, despite the absence of adequate programming for women and minors, the DDR literature finds that many were able to successfully reintegrate through education, relying on dense networks of ex-combatants, and through community-based projects and social action, which provided them with a new pro-social identity. Not surprisingly, however, research shows that women and children with the least social support, with a longer history of involvement, and who had witnessed the most violence had a harder time reintegrating. All would have benefited, as Joanna mentioned, from additional psychosocial support to help address the vacuum-like experience of leaving an armed group, as well as the sexual and other forms of violence they may have experienced or witnessed. Fifth, with regards to children associated with armed groups, research shows that they should be treated as victims, as my colleagues mentioned, and returned to their families when safe to do so, but that extended family acceptance may be an issue. Many children who participate in DDR programs reported feeling like they lacked agency in their reintegration, so that is something I think we should be aware of. This is especially true of older children who sought employment rather than education. Some of those children had children of their own to provide for a family, so they really were looking for jobs, not education. So it is important, I think, as Mustafa and others have mentioned, that programming for men, women, and children is tailored to the specific needs of the individual. So these gender and age groups are not monolithic. Sixth, irrespective of gender or age, research on DDR shows quite conclusively, and as Mustafa mentioned, that holding individuals for long periods of time without prosecution or in inhumane or insecure conditions contributes to low self-esteem, insecurity, mistrust, resentment, and hopelessness, all of which breed a discourse of resistance against the state or one's captors and are associated in the literature with re-involvement in an armed group. Further, the longer individuals are detained, the more likely they are to be stigmatized, as Mustafa mentioned, by the communities on which their reintegration depends. So research shows that their extended isolation from the community fuels public fear and suspicion. Stigmatization, in turn, reinforces returnees' deviant status and deviant behavior. It also impedes their ability to find work and it establishes a sustainable livelihood outside of violent extremism. This brings me to my final comment, which is that programming is only one piece of the puzzle. The successful reintegration of violent extremists, specifically their ability to develop pro-social ties and a pro-social identity, depends upon their acceptance into the community. And I think Mustafa nicely highlighted a lot of the challenges that we're confronting here. So governments and practitioners need to be careful in how they frame programming and participants, as the DDR literature suggests that certain language can further securitize and stigmatize these individuals, making it harder for returnees to see a life for themselves outside of violent extremism. Governments and practitioners also need to think seriously not only about the content of programming, but about how to best promote community acceptance of these individuals in order for their reintegration to be successful. And I don't have time to go into today, but the DDR literature does offer some suggestions there in terms of public sensitization measures and other sort of structural approaches. So thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. And thank you to our entire panel. Just to kind of summarize, it was really interesting to hear some, repeated themes that came up as we were going through these discussions. I think what's extremely clear is we have a data problem. We have issues with counting who has gone to join these foreign conflicts, and also how people have returned and who has returned. Austin brought that up, the formal versus informal pathways. If we don't know who's gone, sometimes we don't know who has returned. So those were really great points. Also, we have a definition problem. How do we define foreign terrorist fighters? How do we define adults? How does that have implications for many of the minors that went over and that we are seeing in prison, some as young as 12? We have a nuance problem. We have issues of understanding gender and agency. And we also have an issue with understanding the difference between local and foreign individuals who joined these groups and the implications for that. And finally, we have a future problem. We have an inability to understand that the indefinite detention and how this has had an effect on the conflict and its implications on the future. So I think those were some really interesting points that I heard reiterated. We have a few questions that have come in. Again, I'd like to encourage our audience to submit a few more, but I'm going to use my moderator's prerogative and start with a few questions of my own. First, to Mustafa, I'd love to hear from you about, what do you see academics and practitioners doing right, and where do we see gaps still remaining? I think you've had a very unique experience being able to go and speak and work with people. And so what have you seen kind of on the ground being done correctly, and where do we need to improve a bit?
Thanks, Deborah. I mean, I won't take too much time on this because I don't know if my recommendations are necessarily great. However, I do think something that was brought up around working with communities in order to create the successful pathways for people to reintegrate is really key. And understand like the amount of stigmatization. If you look at the United States, for instance, if you look at people who are reintegrating after committing terrorist offenses, you only have to imagine the amount of stigma, and they've committed offenses that come with trying to reintegrate and just have a normal job. Used to call it, and I've talked to both a detainee who was 17 at the time and someone who had actively come back, and they called it Googleability. You can easily find me, and then you know what I did. Of course, I'm going to be stigmatized. I won't find a job. I won't be able to get education. Primary things generally with the subset of men is finding a wife, that sort of thing. Now, in some of these other contexts, the bigger issue is that you have governments that are actually playing a role in stigmatization. You also then are continually stigmatized by others within a camp setting. So she's a female head of a household. I wonder what her husband did or what she was doing with her husband. And these are all issues that if you can't address that, I don't think you can accurately rehabilitate, much less reintegrate anyone, because they're going to have to deal with the community. And as long as the community is stigmatized and polarized along those lines, it's going to be really difficult. So I just think that the sensitization piece is really important, but also the systems piece is really important as well.
Excellent, thank you. Mary Beth, you spoke a little bit about what we can learn from DDR, but I was wondering if there's any parts of the literature that don't translate to this current foreign terrorist fighter conflict. If there's anything that you think kind of, lessons learned is great, but is there anything that people are going to try to pull lessons from that they really shouldn't?
Well, I mean, I think that, you take the lessons and you take them in context. So, people reintegrating, into the US or the UK, obviously, I think one of the important differences is that the communities are different, right? These aren't the communities that experience firsthand the conflict. So that's something to keep in mind, and thinking about how that, relates to stigma and those sorts of things. So it could be worse, it could be better. So, I think that there are certain things that don't directly translate, but I think you can account for those. With regard to public sensitization measures, because I know Mustafa was speaking about that, there is some promising research from DDR that does show that these public sensitization campaigns that highlight the importance of reintegration, and that highlight things like children are victims, right? Or certain people were coerced, or not everyone committed crimes. I think we on the panel are all aware of that, but I'm not sure the general public is. So there is some really promising research that shows that these things can actually help promote reintegration. I'm doing some work with Gordon Club in the UK, and we're actually finding that mentioning that someone just participated in a program, not that it was effective, but just that they participated in a program and completed it, that actually increases the willingness of people to behaviorally engage with the individuals. So I think that there are some promising findings.
Excellent, thank you. We've already gotten some great questions that have come in from the audience. So I'm going to start with this one. This one's asked, foreign fighters are most likely to participate in attacks once they return to their home nations. I will pause right there because I saw that David Mallet was on, and his great work with Rachel Hayes talks about actually how the unlikelihood of this is. So definitely going to point out and give a shout out to Rachel and David's work. But the question says, many European countries have immature terrorism laws that prevent them from sufficiently keeping radicalized foreign fighters off the streets, which have led to many of our partner nations refusing to repatriate foreign fighters. How do we encourage partner nations to repatriate, or should we just encourage them to focus on repatriating women and minors? Joanne, I'd love to turn to you and have you talk a little bit about your work with Prepare, and maybe for the audience, which is more US based, explain what Prepare is trying to do in the European context.
Sure, thank you. I think the question highlights a very legitimate concern that many express across Europe. So there is a great perception that the security risk posed by returnees is the main hurdle to repatriation. This is really what's prevented many governments from doing that. But I would in fact argue the opposite. And if we look at the recent prison break in El Hasaka, we look at just how volatile the situation over there is. And what we see now is, as people in detention, is something that could change overnight. So the risk of these individuals remaining in detention over there is something very fragile. And bearing in mind that these individuals have not undergone trial, their victims have not received justice in cases where crimes have been committed, they continue to be a problem being dealt with by the SDF and local forces as opposed to governments taking care of their citizens. And right now, ISIS is currently conducting thousands of attacks in Iraq and Syria. So in fact, the populations that are suffering the most right now continue to be locals in those regions. It is the international community's responsibility to repatriate their citizens and to manage them at home. We're also talking about very small populations. So if you look at the case of Iraq, we're talking about tens of thousands of individuals being moved from Northeast Syria back to Iraq. If we look at European countries, we're talking about dozens in some cases. In certain countries, maybe a few hundred. But we are much more capable and better prepared to deal with these populations in a more manageable approach at home. And bearing in mind that we're talking about very different populations, including children who are our citizens, our most vulnerable citizens, not receiving the support that they require. So I would absolutely advocate for children to be coming home. And this is something we're looking at in the Prepare project. So I'm very proud of the consortium we've put together on this, but we're looking at 6 European countries and looking around the stigmas and the stigmas around children and the vulnerabilities around children who come from violent extremist families in particular. So both from far right and jihadist backgrounds. So the primary concern of us, or of our consortium, is to really identify what those vulnerabilities are, what those stigmas are, and how they can best be supported. So the reintegration and long-term support and livelihood and just success of these children can really be supported in the best way possible. But again, it's great to see work from Insight and from George Washington University and initiatives like Mustafa, who are also focusing on some of these topics as well. So it's great to see a lot of other efforts out there really focusing on this topic.
Thank you, Joanna. Austin, I'm going to turn to you to talk a little bit about last week's events, and maybe you can delve a little bit more into the article that we published this morning with Washington Post. What are some of the key blind spots you see complicating this process?
Yeah, thanks, Dev. And thank you to all the panelists. I've been taking down notes and learning from your insights. So this has been great. Dev, I think this is a really important question, and it really gets to the heart of the issue, right? Where the repatriation and reintegration of foreign fighter families has been wrapped up in debate now for years. To your point, the recent events in Syria have really edged out many of the overlapping dimensions that make this problem set a persistent challenge. Governments have several tools available, a more clear set of tools available to deal with frontline foreign fighters. And we tend to talk about this mostly of males, right? But in the case of the United States, most of the reintegrated adults have been prosecuted. But governments still lack a coherent policy. The international community lacks a coherent policy to process or help others, right? And particularly women and minors who didn't take up as clearly defined battlefield positions. I think the Ekron case is in some ways an exceptionally clear one and an exception to that point. The majority of persons who travel from the US or other Western states have not been repatriated, and detention is the norm. And so this is the product, we think, of some blind spots that also produces important blind spots with respect to defining these actionable solutions. So to your question, I see a number of knowledge gaps and blind spots, including ones that we highlighted in our piece that's out this morning in the Washington Post, that affects this process. And it ultimately produces inefficient and in many cases, undesirable outcomes. Some of these points have already been raised by the other panelists, but I think at least two misconceptions, two of these blind spots are worth reinforcing here. First, that there are persistent misconceptions about how the Islamic State's blueprint for insurgency and governance relates to this process. We tend to hyper-focus on the group's violent operations, but as we know, this wasn't just a military effort, right? It was a deeply political and social one. And foreign fighters played important roles sort of along those lines, not just in supporting on the battlefield, but in reinforcing the Islamic State's vision of becoming a destination for what it would consider to be the world's true believers, or a community of true believers. And so we look at last week's event in Syria and we see the large number of minors, including foreigners, held in detention. And this points to just the still present challenges of being clear in what we mean by foreign fighters. As we mentioned earlier, unlike in previous waves, the Islamic State's mobilization in Syria and Iraq showed that the group made concerted efforts to recruit not just military-age men, but also women and children, families, in a variety of roles in support of their governance ambitions and to help legitimize their rule. I think a number of myths in this regard still persist and impede efforts to create this sort of coherent reintegration policy regarding families. Second, there is a misconception among many that this current solution, this state of sort of infinite detention of limbo, is harmless. Or maybe a better way to say it is that it's without significant risk. More than 20,000 children affiliated with foreign fighters remain in detention in the Iraq and Syria area. The current situation reflects a choice, sort of a consensus in the international community, and actually carries consequences. Unfortunately, the solution isn't simple, right? I think it's important that we identify potential pitfalls and work to mitigate those through effective programming. And to some important points made earlier, it's not just about programming, it's about that dyadic relationship between returnees and their returning communities. But continuing to kick the can down the road in the state of infinite detention creates its own set of risks, including the harm or radicalization of persons who are still being detained. And so the United States, in addition to other world nations, have called for change and are taking leadership in this area. But for many countries, progress has been slow. In the meantime, an entire generation is growing up in these facilities and under these conditions. They're facing systematic lapses in healthcare, exposure to violence, and severe hunger. And as a final thought, and this was mentioned earlier, but I think it's worth pointing out or reinforcing that as we're looking at 3 years after the collapse of the caliphate, that many of the individuals who were brought in by parents to Syria and Iraq as minors are now coming of legal age. And this, I think, complicates this process further.
Thank you so much, Austin. I'm going to combine a few questions because some of them are overlapping, but we've gotten, Mary Beth, a few questions about DDR and identifying risk factors, coercion, and push, kind of how individuals, how can we look, sorry, how should I rephrase this? Because I'm combining a few questions. What approach do you believe should be taken identifying risk factors, as well as how do we raise awareness about foreign fighters that sometimes have been coerced or pushed into conflicts? And are there any practical recommendations from the DDR literature?
Yeah, so in terms of risk factors, I think this ties in nicely with what Austin was mentioning about, how the fact that we've missed a lot of, the families and the children because we're focused so much on the fighters. In terms of risk factors, we tend, the international community at least tends to focus a lot on recidivism rates. And while, they have their challenges and, they have their use, they miss these people who have not committed crimes. And so I really think that there should be an emphasis on focusing on reintegration because, it addresses everyone from the child, to, people who, as Joanna mentioned, grandparents who may have traveled there, and were affected by trauma and other sorts of things. In terms of risk for those who have committed crimes, research shows, I saw a question, those who remain ideologically committed, who remain connected to the group, they are much more likely to re-engage. And the fact that you have them all sitting there in a camp, they're more connected than ever. So, it just reiterates the need to get them home and to start working on their reintegration. Age, so a lot of the similar things we find in crime. So age is related. And we also find in our research coming from a low socioeconomic status. And again, because these are individuals who may lack the social support needed or the alternatives available to them in terms of reintegration. The second part of the question was about DDR practice. How do we highlight that individuals have been coerced? Is that?
Yeah, just kind of addressing, is that part of the lens within the research?
Yeah, so it's not my specific research, but the research that I reviewed on DDR, yes, there are some, there is some research, and you need to think about context, right? So in Uganda, in Burundi, there were radio campaigns, obviously that might play out in other countries, but just highlighting, I think that the media, in the West, so to speak, and Mustafa could probably say the same for what he's seeing in the MENA region, really securitizes these individuals, and some of them deserve to be securitized. I'm not saying that they don't, but what happens is you miss that nuance that, again, I think many on the panel and probably listening know, but that the general public doesn't know. Like, not every child who went there, or every child who went there is a victim, is a vulnerable victim. So I think that there are ways that can be conveyed to the general public so that they are more accepting of these individuals.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Which is a really great transition to Mustafa. Again, I'm going to be combining a few questions. But what parts of civil society should be involved in these reintegration efforts? And a second kind of follow-up question is there a role for religious institutions and figures to be involved?
I think the more the merrier, but at the same time, we need to also build up the infrastructure around sort of those interventions to ensure that everyone is safe in the process, and also that there are channels when things go awry. Now, in regards to like religious institutions, I just want to preface this statement by, this is my own personal opinion. You have to think about ISIS and in regards to the ideology as a counterculture movement. So if you're bringing in mainstream sort of religious institutions, religious figures in to do some of the intervention work, you're going to obviously face some pushback. You're obviously going to deal with some challenges there. You're also going to deal with the fact that a lot of a number of imams will have issues with working with sisters at the same time. You're also going to deal with issues such as, I'm not saying all, you're also going to deal with issues that a lot of imams are out of touch with what happens with younger Muslim communities. It's just a fact of being a Muslim. My imam does not know what Discord is, for instance, but I'm on it with a bunch of other Muslims. Anyway, what I'm saying is that they're all vital components, but if there's no structure there and clear sort of assessment of what the gaps could be of, for instance, a civil society group working with some of these kids versus another organization that's been trained, or psychologists that have been trained, or psychiatrists that have been trained. The problems are that you need to upskill a lot of these people to do the work. You need to ensure that there's a safety mechanism in place, not just for them, but also for the individuals. You can definitely re-traumatize someone through an intervention process and go through an intervention or reintegration process where they slip back if they are indeed radicalized. So there are all these issues that you really have to bear in mind. And I'm not saying that civil society isn't up to the task. I'm just saying that you need to think about how you structure it, not just saying, let's just throw all CSOs at it and see how it goes, right? And I'll give a very quick example. In Kenya, for instance, they were working with Al-Shabaab returnees the very early stages. And what happened there was severe pushback from the communities in which some of these CSOs were working with Al-Shabaab returnees, which included the communities themselves actively attacking civil society organization members and chasing down the suspected members of the group. So there is pushback, even when there's pushback and consequences, even if it's well-intentioned. So I'm just saying that there needs to be a structure there. There needs to be training. That's it. I don't know if I answered the question.
I think you did. I think you absolutely did. Thank you. We are also getting a lot of questions about the work on data. And so again, I'd like to reiterate and give a great shout out to Joanna Cook and Gina Vale's excellent articles with ICSR and CTC Sentinel. So if somebody asked, where can I find those? ICSR and CTC Sentinel, that's really important and vital work in tracking this kind of gendered lens and understanding the nuances between the men, women, and minors who traveled, and one of the first data sets to really do so at a large scale. And so, Joanna, I'd like to ask a little bit about the lessons you and Gina learned from creating that data set and kind of the challenges you faced as you were creating that data set as well.
Yeah, well, I've noticed Gina here as well, so it would be I'll speak on my own behalf here because I'm sure she's had many insights into this as well. But I think the biggest thing is just really trying to identify assumptions that you have going into this, right? So, I mean, some of these cases were so complex and so nuanced that, if you had a child whose mother had 2 passports, and if the father had 2 passports related to 4 different countries, and, you're looking at the kind of the complexities around populations was so detailed that you really have to take the time to properly sit and think through these things and also identify what kind of factors also impede being able to fully understand those numbers. So if you're looking at the coalition against Daesh, there were significant airstrikes around the region that they can't account for how many individuals were killed. They can't account for how many civilians were killed. What were the distinctions between civilians and ISIS-related family members that were killed? So there's a lot of problems even being able to grab full numbers of this from every angle of the context. But as we're looking at ISIS today, if you look at a place like Al-Hol camp, what we do have now is the benefit of having these family members in one single location. So we have a much better understanding of the demographics now. And I think it is so important to be aware of what those demographics look like. We're looking at an incredibly young population now too. And so we're not just thinking about foreign terrorist fighters, adults, militants. We're thinking about children that are 5 years old and under. So we really have to shift the narrative and shift the kind of mindset in terms of how we even think about these populations, because the entire field of terrorism studies has very much focused on the most extreme cases of violence and the most shocking public displays of violence. But we're looking at a population today that really contradicts that, and the stigmas attached to those populations really impede the kind of programming and interventions that are really best suited to support them. So, for example, I'll just give one very brief example, but if you had a child that got recruited into a gang, if you had a child that was trafficked over international borders for sex work, for example, you don't view these children as you view them as victims, right? And there's a real kind of perception that we don't have a similar extension of that kind of thinking to these kids. And that is something that I think we really have to do, because those kind of stigmas really impact kind of policy opportunities for those. So, and I think, sorry, the very, very last point, but it's something also that Mary Beth has highlighted as well here, but really understanding the kind of roles that they take and the kind of interventions that are most appropriate. Having a gender lens integrated, an age-appropriate lens integrated at every step is absolutely crucial to fully understanding the picture and the demographic, and really having the most accurate assessment of what you're looking at and the tools best suited to address that.
Thank you so much. And thank you to our whole panel in the audience that has been extremely actively engaged. Unfortunately, we don't have time to answer all of these questions if we want to end in a timely manner. But again, every single panelist here has so much to offer. In our chat, my colleague Andrew noted, we're going to try to promote as much of this research on our website as possible from all of the amazing panelists. And again, just to kind of conclude with these thoughts, again, there seems to be 4 overarching themes that have come out of this panel. We've got an absolute data problem. Counting who is going, how we're counting people really affects how we count how they return. We have a definition problem, understanding the differences between minors and adults and how we define the 4 entire spider problem and families is vital for how we counter it. Furthermore, we have a nuance problem. If we're not talking about issues of gender and age, local versus foreign, we're absolutely missing some gaps. And finally, there's the future problem, understanding the implications of this for the future, the indefinite detention, what it means for humanitarian as well as security issues. And with that,